nonprofits and people who work in nonprofits and donors and foundations, we have to be ready to innovate and incorporate these changes.
Yeah, we risk becoming irrelevant if we don't.
Yeah.
That's so true. You can launch an idea as a small experiment or a minimum viable product, to get more buy-in from our team members. I can't recommend design thinking enough. I just think it's very good to go through those logic steps. What's your superpower? And in a way, it's what economists would call figuring out your comparative advantage. But I call it what's your superpower?
Welcome back to part 3 with Leah Kral and Nonprofit Docs. She is the author of this book right here, Innovation for Social Change. And so one of the questions I want to kick off with Leah, by the way, Leah has over 20 years experience in the nonprofit sector. She is a consultant and she can help your organization. And we'll put her information down here at the bottom of the description. So, Leah, let's kick off with this. What does it mean when you say optimize organizational design for innovators? What does that mean?
So in the previous section, we talked about kind of that first section of my book, which is all about surfacing creative ideas and unleashing imagination. That's really important, right? But then to me, a logical question for the middle part of the book was, if we want everyday innovation, well, what does it take to build that into our workplace? And so it kind of gets at processes and systems, right? And if we want to see innovation just be part of our normal work. And so I have this really good graphic in the book. It looks a little bit like a seesaw, and you're balancing two things. So on the one hand, you do need formal systems and processes to ensure quality of what you're doing, especially as you grow. But on the other hand, we don't want bureaucracy that squashes creativity. So it's a balance, right? How do we strike that right balance? And so there is no one cookie cutter. There's so many nonprofits with different missions. So I can't just give you a nice one pager with, look, here's what you need. This is how you should build your systems. You have to figure out that right balance, right? And that's what part 2 of my book helps you think through. And so if you're systems nerd like me, then you'll really like this part. So I love telling stories that help illustrate the concept. So one of my favorite stories is from Mayo Clinic. Mayo Clinic might be the best nonprofit hospital in the world. They're famous for finding innovative solutions for people who are very sick. And their reputation did not happen by accident. It was very intentional, all these kind of systems and processes that they have. So in interviews, team members at Mayo Clinic will say that good patient outcomes are because they are empowered to the staff is empowered to carry out their organizational values. And one of those values is the needs of the patient come first. And they seem to truly live this. Like, you've probably seen every organization, right, has their list of values, and some are nothing more than platitudes on the wall, right? But Mayo Clinic builds this in, right? They empower people to do it. So team members are trained, empowered, and encouraged to put Mayo values into practice every day. And those values become part of their workplace culture, guiding all decisions, big or small. So a great example, right? The Mayo Clinic night staff were really concerned about how noise can interfere with a patient's sleep, which, as you know, is so important to the healing process.
I can attest to that, having been in the hospital and wondering how the world do you get well when all
Right.
night long they're interrupting you for tests and blood pressure and all that. Yeah.
And
So what
there's
did they come
over
up with? Yeah.
So they came up with this idea first just to conduct noise studies, to say what is the level of noise that's going on here. And so one step after another, right? This led to designing quieter flooring, quieter wheels on food carts, and lower decibels for overhead paging. To me, that's innovation, right? So it was just a humble night staff, right? But they knew they were empowered to that organizational value. The needs of the patient come first. The culture, it's not accidental. And so how Mayo Clinic designs their recruitment, their interview process, their onboarding process, their performance reviews, right, are all built to make sure that those things are happening. And you think about all the things that feed into our work, how our workplace functions in reality. What do our processes and systems look like? Who gets to make decisions in the organization and why? Are you top down? Are you bottom up? What's the thinking behind that? We talked earlier, I have a chapter in this section on metrics, right? How they're designed can help or hinder innovation and empowerment. What about your workplace culture, right? Are people afraid to speak up? So how we we can intentionally design all of those to either incentivize and encourage innovation or completely squash it.
That's fascinating. And I actually was acquainted with a fundraiser for Mayo, and he dealt with donors. And the way they dealt with donors was impressive. And I remember a story he told me where a donor came to him and wanted to do a particular project. And he said, well, we don't have that project, but I can direct you to another organization that does. And I said, really? You did that? He goes, yeah, because I knew that the donor would appreciate my honesty and my help. And eventually they did come back and they funded other things. And so Mayo has a very interesting philosophy of being trustworthy and they're actually very selective with who they take as patients now too, because I think they're overrun. Everybody wants to go to Mayo now, right? Well, great. So how do we make our innovations appealing to donors and foundations and other stakeholders?
I always remember I knew a really experienced grant writer, and she and I were talking one day, and she advised that one of the biggest mistakes in grant writing is neglecting to include any sort of analysis of risks or what might cause our efforts to lag or fail. So when we avoid our discussion of risk, right, that just makes a proposal look bad. I think it might even make us look a bit naive. And grant makers, they're going to be skeptical that the program and the proposal have been really sufficiently thought through. And so, an example I love, and I included it in the book, was a nonprofit called ROCA, ROCA. They're a nonprofit working with at-risk young men in Baltimore and Boston, and they just share. It's on their website. I'm sure it's in their grant proposals. They're super honest about how hard the work is. These young men don't trust easily. They're in tough environments, and probably rightfully so. There's probably a reason why these young men don't trust anyone. They've suffered trauma, brokenness, abuse. That's how ROCA describes what they do. They say, I'm quoting now, when a young man is experiencing a crisis, we track him down through his friends. We call him. We show up at his doorstep. We scout the streets until we find him. For example, we made 112 contacts until a young man in Baltimore joined one of our programs. That's the end of the quote. Wow, right?
That's a
And
lot of effort. Wow.
they don't hide it. They're like, look, this is hard work. These
Yeah.
young men probably are right that they don't trust people. We have to break through that. That's
Yeah.
part of the very hard work that we're doing. We're going to be honest and transparent about it. So, I think they realize it might take 100 conversations until that work of trust and healing can begin from a very broken situation. So we know, right? If we're working in social impact, we're trying to find a way where there is no way a lot of times. So if you were a foundation and you got that grant proposal, it would make you think pretty hard, right? You'd be impressed that they were so transparent. I think it would build a lot of credibility. Compare a proposal like that to something kind of glossy and just say, oh, yeah, we're terrific. We're fantastic. All our programs are great versus that honesty of, no, we're going to tell you what it takes and what we've learned it takes. So to me, that part of design thinking that we spoke about earlier, where we asked ourselves what's feasible, that's where you're giving your team the place to say, let's surface risks. Let's give ourselves credit. Like, this is hard work. Let's talk about it. Let's be transparent about it. Let's show how we've done our homework and, that we've thought through feasibility so that we're not overselling or being groundlessly optimistic. And so I think that practical check keeps your vision inspiring, but also credible, right? Something funders will greatly respect. And I think innovation and breakthroughs are super exciting to donors, right? They want their resources to help, bring about breakthroughs and new ways of doing things. And to me, that real magic happens when it's the funders and nonprofits who are sharing knowledge, collaborating, right? And having meaningful conversations together about risks and obstacles. And that's really where the learning, discovery, and innovation becomes much more likely.
I think what you have brought up here is a big gap that has been missing before. I remember when I first started grant proposal writing, I was advised that you don't say, we're going to try to, or we're going to attempt to. You say, we will, and we will do this, and we will do that, being very positive about your abilities to do things. And it sounds to me like you're saying, okay, you can say that, but you also have to say, but here are the risks involved, right? Now, if you're writing a grant proposal and you're using a previous model that has worked in other areas, it's probably not as necessary. But if you're doing a new innovative program, you do have to put for the risk and what that means to the donor and to the foundation. So I think having a balance of those two things, saying we can do this program, we have the resources and the personnel to do it, but here are the challenges that we're going to encounter, and putting that up front. I think that's brilliant because I think one of the keys to getting foundation funding, in addition to building a relationship with them, is to be honest with them. And I have an interesting story. I probably shared in other videos where I was talking to a senior retired member of a major foundation, and I said, "Well, now that you're retired, can you tell me some truths that nobody wants to hear?" And he goes, "Well, I'll share one with you." He goes, "I would venture that 65% of the grants that we funded, grant proposals that we funded, were failures." And he said, and there are various reasons for that. He said, that is why a lot of foundations will always go to people who they know can get the job done because nobody wants to admit failure. He goes, now here's the thing. Nobody's going to admit that it was a failure. So we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. And I think a couple foundations that have decided that's not good, that if they have failures, they need to talk about that and why they failed and how to fix that, which is a good thing. I think that the Gates Foundation has done that with charter schools and other things. So I think that is a credibility builder. I think you make a great point there.
Yeah, I had what you just said made me think about it. One of my nonprofit clients has this wonderful board. So when they're getting ready for their annual board meeting, the staff, the executive director, they know full well, like the board expects to hear failure stories. If we walk in there and just say, "Oh, everything's great,"
Yeah,
we're going to be in so much hot water because they're going to have those questions. Tell me how you experimented. Tell me about your intelligent failures. Tell me where you took risks and what you learned and how you're adjusting, because anything else doesn't seem very credible, right? And so that's a smart board, and that directive filters into the whole organization and their culture, which I think is brilliant. And I would love funders to have that same sort of attitude because you're not going to have breakthroughs or if you don't build in some toleration of risk and failure.
absolutely. And if you're not a first adopter, then you're basically building on other people's models, which is the safe way to do things, but that's not the innovative way to do things, right? So you talk about discovering your strengths or your superpowers. And that's always interests me because I believe that sometimes our greatest weaknesses can actually be our greatest strengths. And so I'm wondering how that works in innovation.
Yeah, I felt it was important when I got to the last section of the book to talk about how do we bring our own personal innovation A game, because I'd done all these interviews with social entrepreneurs and innovative nonprofit leaders, and there were just things that kind of seemed like a pattern, and I felt like, oh, it's right to include this in the book, and they're all things we can learn and get better at. So there are sections on like persuasiveness, tenacity, but one of them was what's your superpower, and in a way, it's what economists would call figuring out your comparative advantage, but I call it what's your superpower. And so to me, to be entrepreneurial, we have to say no to things. We have to prioritize what we spend our time on. Are we guardians of our time like we're guardians of our bank account? We cannot say yes to everything, and we have limited time and have to make smart trade offs with our time and our talents. So, how do we get there? How do we figure that out for ourselves and focus on what we do best? To me, it starts by being clear about our unique abilities and our vision for life. Full questions that I include. These are things you can kind of think through for yourself. So, what in your life sparks joy? That Marie Kondo question, and you can even ask the converse. What have you done that you know that you hate, right? How do you learn that about yourself? And it could be a process of elimination. I know I volunteered to help a nonprofit with an event. And being an introvert, I very quickly learned I'm a disaster at events. I should never do that, right? Process that I learned, right? You learn, so no events career for me, and that's fine. Another question, do you have a really unexpected or maybe even a wacky combination of interests? And I think of Fred Rogers had the strangest combination of passions, right? He was into puppetry. He was a very talented musician. He went to Presbyterian seminary, right? So he had this kind of very deep moral passion, and he was interested in children's television. That's a pretty odd combination, but in hindsight, right, that's what made him him. For me, my oddball thing that I never would have thought would tie into my work. I'm an introvert, as I mentioned. I'm a reader. On the weekends, I can't read enough biographies. I love people's stories. I'm reading all the time and just thought it was my hobby. It's a thing I do just for fun. But now, right, look at the storytelling that I'm doing and pulling into my book and my work, right?
Right.
So sometimes something you don't expect, some sort of odd talent or passion, might be a really important part of your career. I don't know if have you found that?
Well, I mean, I am a storyteller. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there are a lot of things I'm not good at. I was blessed with a deep voice, and my father was a barber as I grew up, and I used to sit in his barber shop, and I used to listen to all the men spin their yarns, and I was just fascinated. And I think my love of storytelling came from that, and so I think storytelling is one of my strengths. And I think the storytelling, we live in stories. We really do. I mean, even if we have an analytical mind, we still have stories about ourselves, about our families, about our careers. So we live in stories. So I think autobiographies and stories about nonprofits, very, very powerful thing. And I'll tell you the most powerful thing that I found with nonprofits is their clients telling stories about how the nonprofit affected their life. And that to me, as a donor, that is more powerful than any statistic you can give me. If I hear somebody's story saying, if it hadn't been for this organization, my life would have been very different, and I probably never would have attained the successes I have, then I know that that nonprofit has been successful, right?
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
think stories are so important. We have social media out there. You can start a YouTube channel for free. And of course, there are legal issues here with recording people telling their stories. But if you have their permission, record their stories about how the nonprofit affected their life, or tell that story and put it on YouTube, put it on your Facebook page, on your website, because people need to know that. You have to go to heart with people, and stories is the way you do that.
Yeah. And storytelling, it's such a great talent. I think of still speaking of kind of people's superpowers, a nonprofit founder I know who I really admire. She founded a nonprofit called Cameras for Girls, and so she kind of brought her own unique background. She had a background in the television industry and the video industry. Has is both a Canadian citizen and her family originally came from Uganda, had to leave during a period of violence. But she had this kind of two unique things she brought together. One, her deep knowledge of cameras, videography, and her passion for these young women back in Uganda who needed a career path. So she kind of brought those two, she found her superpower, right, by bringing those two unusual things together. Um, Another question of how do you find your superpower? I think you mentioned a little bit of this earlier, that a major life trial, right? Some sort of hardship can really shape your passion. For Martin Luther King, it was deep passion for the unjust Jim Crow laws that were affecting everyone he loved, his family, right? Affecting him personally and deeply, and it shaped him. Fred Rogers I didn't know this about him until I started reading a biography, but he had severe childhood asthma that isolated him. And he started, just because he was lonely and a playful child, he started designing puppets and skits, right? Back when he was
Mhm.
just isolated by himself. So if you or someone you care about has experienced some sort of major life challenge that shaped you, think about that, right? And Congressman Elijah Cummings, he said he tells his children, don't ask why something happened to you, ask why it happened for you, right? I think that's really powerful. You can ask, is there some problem that you just can't look away from? So to me, like, thinking through some of those self-reflection questions can help you figure that out for yourself. What's your superpower? And it's going to strengthen you, right, when you know that
Well,
about yourself.
I've always said that the more challenges we have, the more disasters we have to live through, the more valuable we become as human beings. Because if our lives went perfectly, we wouldn't be much use to the human race, right? I mean, if everything we touched turned to gold and we never had any challenges, how would we help other people? What would we tell them, right?
Yeah.
And I absolutely believe that those challenges, those sometimes are a superpower because if you're dealing with children from divorce, if you've never been through a divorce, you don't really have that framework. But if you do, you understand their feelings. Not that I wish bad things on people, but I think we have to look at those challenges in life as ways that we acquire wisdom and then can share that to help other people.
Yeah. Very true.
Do we have to challenge the status quo? Is that absolutely a prerequisite? That's not something that comes naturally to us because I think we are brought up even from through our elementary and high school days to kind of go with the flow, to believe what everybody tells us, to not challenge the teacher. And now we know as we get older that a lot of the things we were taught were not exactly true, right? Since we were taught to kind of believe the authority, believe in the way things were done. How do we undo that? How do we get people to challenge their everyday thinking?
Yeah, I guess I keep going back to stories, right? To me, maybe that's my superpower.
Yeah.
By just telling convincing, compelling stories, it will help people see the value in challenging the status quo. And there's different ways of doing things. Your question makes me think too. Sometimes maybe this what we're doing now is the right thing. Um, you know, uh, yeah, I think there are always ways of finding new and it's important to find new and better ways of doing things. Maybe like, ask curious questions. The answer might be what's happening now is the right thing. But at least we're raising it, we're testing our assumptions, we're asking. Like the example of maybe you're at a pro bono legal aid clinic and you've got like an your current intake system is just people filling out lots of pages of paper on a clipboard, and you just come up with this simple idea of well, let's switch to an iPad. Right now our data is just going straight into the system. That's a very small, I mean, did you just challenge the status quo of how you've been doing this paper-based system? Yeah, that's a small thing. But by questioning, right, you made a small breakthrough, right? So there's so many ways of thinking about it. But there are like really big situations. I think of Archbishop Desmond Tutu when there was South African apartheid. He spent his career making really unpopular arguments. The status quo was very bad, right? Apartheid. So Desmond Tutu played a key role amongst others, as a highly influential social entrepreneur, transforming the rights of Black South Africans and democracy in his country, eventually winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But he often had this saying of, don't raise your voice, improve your arguments. I like that a lot, right? We improve our arguments not by being loud or pushy or through violence, as we're seeing now in the US, sadly, but by truly hearing out our opponents, by anticipating weaknesses in our own arguments, and by recognizing risks that could cause our efforts to fail, right? We can show we've done our homework and how we've thought about feasibility. We've talked about a lot of these things in our conversation, but we can improve our argument, right, by creating a really strong value proposition or theory of change. We can make a pitch with a range of options, for whatever it is we're proposing. It's maybe we don't just say, give me $10,000. It could be, well, here's what $10,000 would do. Here's what 5,000 would do. Here's what 50 would do, right? Giving
Mm.
people options. So you can launch an idea as a small experiment or a minimum viable product to get more buy-in from our team members. I can't recommend design thinking enough. I just think it's very good to go through those logic steps, right? And that's going to help you improve your argument. And it's a great way to surface team ideas collaboratively and get buy-in amongst your team for good ideas. But also, for challenging the status quo, we have to prepare ourselves for a no or a not yet. I mentioned how, Mother Teresa and Fred Rogers were often told no, had doors closed in their faces. But I think that should be encouraging to us, right? Like if it's going to happen to them, it's going to happen to us. And we have to have a thick hide, be ready to hear no, right, and come back with a stronger argument. But I also think like if you're an innovative person and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm in a toxic work environment, my ideas never go anywhere. You can take your time and talents elsewhere. I think we're always in the driver's seat of our careers. Life is short. So it's to me, all those factors kind of come into play when we're thinking about how we're going to challenge the status quo, and it's going to get uncomfortable, and that's okay. And that's why I go about this with so many stories, right, about ordinary people who care, who can't look away from a problem, and have just worked really hard to find new and better ways of doing things. You're right with that question about how uncomfortable it can be challenging the status quo. It's not easy, but the people we're serving in the nonprofit world are counting on us, right?
I have been in situations where, um, of course, I love to be innovative. I love entrepreneurial acts, those kinds of things. And I've been in situations where I found out very quickly that nobody really cared about it. They didn't want to make the effort. It was new and different, and it was a very conventional situation. And I learned very quickly to keep my ideas to myself. Now, the problem with that as leaders, and when I teach leadership programs, I talk about this. It's so important. As leaders, we cannot we cannot make people fearful of us because first of all, they're going to shut down. Second of all, they're not going to give us their best ideas. They're not going to be honest with us. So the information we're getting from our people is not going to be correct information. They're going to tell us what we think we need to know, or they think we want to know. And they're not going to tell us the truth oftentimes. And quite frankly, and I've said this in other programs, in my younger years, I was quite brash as a leader, and I thought I had to have the answers to everything. And I made a lot of mistakes. I made people, um, I don't want to say fear me, but be very wary of pointing out things that they didn't think were quite true or feasible. And I've learned as a leader now, you don't need to know everything. In fact, it's better if you don't. You need to ask your people. But what I have realized is the only constant in the world is change. And if we don't embrace that and understand that things constantly change, I mean, when you look at our technology now, you know, I'm from the generation that remembers when there were no cell phones and there were no remote controls for TVs. And now you look at this now we've got quantum computing, we've got AI, everybody has a cell phone. I don't know about you, but I do a lot of work on my cell phone. I do very, very little on my computer unless it's a big project. And the evolution of that is such a short period of time. In the next 20 years, with everything that's going on, change is going to happen at a very rapid pace. So we have to be, as nonprofits and people who work in nonprofits and donors and foundations, we have to be ready to innovate and incorporate these changes.
Yeah, we risk becoming irrelevant if we don't.
Yeah.
That's so true. Yeah, I mean, just things change, as you say. Like, right, what is it? The buggy whip manufacturers went out of business, right? When
Yes.
when the cars, it can be uncomfortable, but yeah, you're right. Change is going to happen no matter what. AI changing the world right under our feet, right? I have a nephew who's studying robotics, and he said every time a white paper comes out on AI, it's pretty much irrelevant just a few days later.
Yeah.
And it's evolving that quickly. Yeah, and all of these things, right, are going to very much impact the nonprofit space. So yeah, we must have an innovative mindset and be curious and adaptive, or we'll become irrelevant.
Absolutely. Well, Leah, thank you very much. And I really appreciate your work in the area of innovation and nonprofits. And again, if you want her book, we'll put a link below. Innovation for Social Change right here. Got to get it right. There we go. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. And I wish you a lot of luck in your consulting and with the nonprofits you consult with, because we need it. We need it badly, and we need it quickly. And we can't wait around for tomorrow. We have to be innovative now. So thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it was an honor to be here, and thanks for all you do to create this great content that's very needed in the nonprofit sector. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, and I hope it helps people. Thank you. So, for those of you who are watching this, this is the part three, the end of part three of our three-part series. And if you want to know more about the nonprofit sector, you can either go here or go here.